Hello everyone and welcome to this Ostmine webinar. I'm Marianne Cummings, Director of Strategic Development at Ostmine, and I'm pleased to be your host today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Awabakal people in the coastal area south of the Hunter River in Newcastle. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all working today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending this webinar. Today's webinar is the second of our ESG series that is running throughout 2022. Our series will feature various panel discussions and tech talks to provide a comprehensive examination of the current landscape, emerging issues, future priorities regarding environmental, social and governance factors for mining and METS organisations. In today's webinar, we'll examine mining's environmental priorities and provide an introduction for the tech talks in the following webinars. So we have that other slide. On this slide, you can see that there's the environmental topic. There's a tech talk on several areas of interest, and then we follow that with social and governance for the rest of the series. Today, we're pleased to start with a presentation from Faye Cranmer. Faye is Senior Managing Director of Accenture. Faye's presentation will set the scene for the panel session to follow. In the panel session, Faye will be joined by Peter Johnson, Chairman of MapTech, Sarah Watson, Group Environment, Social and Governance Manager, Harmony, Southeast Asia, and Matt Pyle, Director, Technical Solutions at Ausenco. The panel session will be followed by audience Q&A. Please add your questions in as we go using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote for questions that you would most like answered. I'd now like to hand over to Faye for her presentation. Welcome, Faye.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thanks for inviting me and Accenture to be part of this. Well, I lead our natural resources sector here at Accenture, but I previously have actually been with Rio Tinto for a number of years, and previous to that, actually an oil sands miner in North America. So been in the mining space for quite some time now, particularly in a technology type of role. But I think a lot of what you'll see today is the role of technology in sustainability is growing and growing all the time. So I guess I'm hoping that gives me at least some credibility and basis on which to talk to some of the issues here. I've been in the resources, environment and around mining and energy for my entire 30-year career. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide. You know, when I look at the challenges facing mining today, you know, I see it as a bit of a conundrum, because for years and years, mining has really been the sort of, along with energy and others, sort of the black sheep of the environmental side of things, being seen as a significant contributor to, if you like, all bad things related to environment, whether that be in terms of land use, whether it's about air and water pollution, or indeed the use of energy. But the thing that's become a really interesting challenge for the industry is the fact that it is now one of the most important parts of actually creating the greening effect, especially in the electric vehicle or any of the electric battery operated substitutions that are now being looked at in terms of decarbonization. And so where we have probably the most important industry in actually defining what will happen and the speed with which we can actually drive towards a more sustainable future, including, and don't forget that in all things, even large windmills that are built, they are made of metals that come from ore, which come from the ground through mining. So it's a fascinating scenario, because there's in effect this view of, so what happens next? How do those who are going to become some of the greatest contributors to the future of sustainability, how can we get over what's the current and the past, and the very fact that mining is all about disturbing the earth and disturbing things related to it, and how do we change that, not only in perception but in reality, in terms of the actual ways that all the aspects of mining are done. If you could pop to the next slide, please. So the way I tend to look at it is, we've got a not that long ago, and in some organizations, quite honestly, this is still true, that we've got some fairly questionable environmental practices, and to a large extent, not always that level of accountability. That said, the thing that always fascinates me in the mining and to some degree in the energy space is that this has been a topic of conversation for decades. Why? Because mining actually, as an industry, requires the earth. It requires everything around it to actually be compatible. And so there has always been this fascination, very simply, with actually how do we manage in a cohesive and a very collaborative state, and how do we coexist between that which extracts and disturbs and that which preserves and conserves and takes forward in another way. So the way I look at it is that we've started to see the emergence of governance, a lot more consciousness about reporting, about understanding the situation. And I think that's always a great starting point, because obviously organizations can only really tackle that they know of. So it's really important that we do start with this step of actually knowing what's going on. And that, to some degree, is enforced upon us through various forms of legislation and the complexity of environmental impact studies and all sorts of other things that have come to make actually the development of mines, etc., that much more difficult to do. But at the same time, that's the opportunity to really reimagine the way we do things. And the way I look at it is that mining has this opportunity to actually, to some degree, completely reinvent itself and actually become green by design. And when I say green by design, it's really about not just retrofitting reporting onto what we have today, but it's actually about rethinking the way we do it. And to some extent, that's actually also about designing and building all of our mines and plants of the future with a completely different way of thinking around always designing them to be green from the outcome, from the outset, at least, towards the outcome. And I think that that's something, just like people have talked about safety by design, security by design, we should absolutely be considering everything in terms of green by design as well. If you could pop to the next slide, please. So when you start to think about the value chain of mining, and some people would say some of these things further on are a little bit in a different way around in some mine value chains, but by and large, it's a complex value chain. It involves very different components, very different bits of equipment. In the past, we've kind of used equipment and technology to kind of get us out of a muddle and a bind. I mean, let's think about it. Mining has been effectively done the same way for decades, for a long, long time. The only thing that's really changed is that the actual technology we've applied to each of these silos has evolved over time. But I think what's super important is to start thinking of it in as much more as an integrated system, and making sure that as we're looking at what we're doing in decarbonization, whether it's around land rehabilitation and all of the other things, that we're thinking about it in this end-to-end context. Because our Scope 1 and Scope 2, and for that matter, Scope 3 emissions calculations are based on the entire value chain. They're not based on one component only. And I would say, mining companies are not the best at being fully integrated. They have fully integrated businesses, but they don't always operate in a fully integrated manner. It's been long held knowledge that each of these components can operate very independently and be reported on very independently. But it's about making sure we don't pass the problem on. We don't resolve our responsibilities until we've actually not just handed it over to the customer, the ore, because remember, Scope 3 brings in all of the energy they use and all of the emissions issues that they might create. So we actually have to even start becoming way more conscious about who we sell to. And we recently did a decarbonization study, and it actually found that our biggest impact is around Scope 3. So if we're just playing at Scope 1 and Scope 2, we're kind of not dealing with the real problem. Because in a metals context, if you take iron ore or alumina and the rest, the actual massive energy usage happens at the steel making or the aluminium smelting phase. So it's a really interesting concept that we are also held accountable for all of that. If you could move to the next slide, please. So I think that what becomes quite interesting is the fact that pretty much everybody, all the stakeholders, are in the space of saying, time to get busy, time to get really busy with this. It's important to us. And you know, when I look at this, you know, we should also talk about suppliers, and we should also talk about our communities, because it's not just our consumers. Everybody is actually depending on us as an industry to actually take this extremely seriously, not play lip service, not just report on stuff and make it somebody else's problem, but start to actually live by a new mantra of actually being a very significant part of the solution, not only in the ways that we work, but also in the actual methods we adopt, the technologies we use, etc. So, you know, investors, let's face it, they do like the returns. They will always question whether it's actually a business case to be more green, more sustainable. But the reality is that I think there've been some big cases, not that far in the recent history, where not only the investor communities, but the actual physical communities that live around our mining sites have actually stood up and said, being sustainable, being environmentally conscious is hugely important to us. And we will look to shift our investments if we find that organizations are not prepared to make the big strides. So we are making progress. We are making progress on the continuum. But I think what we need to do is we need to look at the fullness of what this is. It is complicated. It does start by really knowing what you have and making sure you can move from there. It's no point doing sort of random acts of sustainability just so that we can sort of say at the end of the day, look, teacher, can you give me a gold star? It's actually about doing it in a purpose-led manner and in a way that actually goes beyond just reporting. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully that's a bit of food for thought and for some conversations and questions to come. I'll hand back to you, Marianne.
Great, thanks, Faye. That was fantastic, and thanks for sharing those insights on the reinvention of mining. Really, a good way of looking at it. I'd now like to welcome Peter, Sarah, and Matt to join Faye for the panel session. Okay, let's start with introductions and business overviews from our panelists. We've already heard from Faye, so Sarah, could we kick off with you? Could you please introduce Harmony as a business and some of the key environmental focus areas for your operations?
Thanks, Marianne, and pleasure to be here this afternoon. As it says on the screen, I work for Harmony's Southeast Asian branch of the business. I guess lots of you might be familiar with the Harmony Group. We have been one of South Africa's largest gold miners for 70 odd years. And in more recent times have stepped our operations out into PNG. So the Southeast Asian branch of the business deals predominantly with our assets over in Papua New Guinea and then other emerging opportunities in this neck of the woods as well. You know, a significant proportion of our mineral resources and reserves definitely lives in PNG. So from all of our stakeholders, there's a hefty spotlight on us here. And, you know, our future sort of opportunities and projects, which is really exciting. So within PNG, Harmony runs the Hidden Valley copper silver mine, which is up in the Morobe province. We have a 50% stake in the Wafi-Golpu project with Newcrest, and then actively pursuing various other greenfield development opportunities as well. So I think, you know, being over in PNG, it certainly lends itself to a suite of some fairly challenging environmental conditions. And, you know, challenges to us. I think some of the major things that we consider in our current operations, and then when planning and permitting new opportunities, you know, is certainly around the water management side of things. You know, some of these mines, yes, they're in remote areas, but we have a whole host of downstream communities, very sensitive environments, receiving environments. So certainly the focus on water management, how do we minimize our offsite impacts? How do we ensure compliance? How do we predict and monitor those sort of impacts as well is certainly front and center of lots of our operations up there. Tailings management, I saw, you know, like all of these are consistent with what Faye had up on one of her earlier slides, but certainly tailings management, again, from a stakeholder perspective, from our regulatory and our external reporting is certainly critical. So the Hidden Valley mine that operates a conventional tailings storage facility, whereas the Wafi-Golpu project is proposing the use of deep sea tailings. So we've got, you know, a number of tailings technologies in the mix, which is, yeah, it's very interesting. And, you know, some of the other aspects, I guess, front and center would be as we start to approach the tail end of our current mine plan at Hidden Valley, you know, lots of our attention is certainly turning to the mine closure space, to that rehabilitation and optimizing the remaining operational phase to get the best outcomes at the end of the closure period. And then, you know, just recently, I think 2 months ago, Harmony's made its commitment to the net zero drive, and we've pledged to be net zero by 2045. So amongst the group, not just on a Southeast Asian level, but certainly with our colleagues over in South Africa as well, you know, much of what we're starting to focus on now is how do we achieve our science-based targets that we've set ourselves along this journey to net zero, and how do we, you know, integrate into existing and upcoming business, taking ourselves on a greener journey. Thanks, Marianne.
Great, thanks, Sarah. A lot going on there in the environmental space at Harmony. Peter, MapTech is traditionally seen as a global leader in exploration technology and software. So it may not be apparent to our audience why MapTech is so heavily focused on environmental sustainability. Why does it matter so much to you?
Thanks, Marianne. Look, if you consider any of MapTech's products, they're all enabling the application of technical disciplines and technical processes to the natural world, and you know, at every stage in a mining operation, every part of the work that goes on, there's consideration for the impact and the effect of the natural environment on you know, from a number of different factors to the outcomes and the performance and the sustainability of that operation. So this is a range of issues that affect all of our customers across the world. So it's important for us to recognise that, and you know, our customers care about that. If you look at it was summed up, I think, quite succinctly by Dr. Penny Stewart at the AusMine conference last year. I think she said that the mining industry is the interface between nature and manufacturing, and if you consider that sort of statement, that's a really profound, clear way of looking at it, because you know, the world does need resources, the world does need metals and commodities, and to be able to extract that sustainably, there has to be a consideration for the impact on the environment at all stages. So it's become, you know, necessary to look at it that way.
Great, thanks, Peter. Matt, over to you. Ausenco sits at the forefront of construction and development of mining projects and infrastructure. As mining shifted towards greater environmental stewardship, I'm wondering what changes you're seeing in mine and plant design to reduce footprint.
Thanks, Marianne, and nice to be here. Yeah, look, Ausenco's been around for about 30 years and it very much feels like we're at the threshold of, integrating the environment with manufacturing, definitely in the middle there. I suppose the business started by applying an approach that reduces the footprint of the process facilities as they are. And, that Australian engineering approach, which is pretty well done here on average, wasn't always done and isn't always done well in other parts of the world. So, from a plant design perspective, it's not uncommon to be able to reduce the bulk quantities, the steel and concrete, by 60 or 70% and reduce the footprint by half with a good design versus a poor design or a design that isn't motivated the right way. So, we've been doing that for a very long time. I suppose what I wanted to touch on here briefly is some of the larger drivers and the bigger improvements we're seeing in more recent times. So just to put some scale about it, 30 to 50% reduction in power is being achieved, 40 to 70% reduction in water consumption, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 60 to 70% is definitely in the realm of possible and actually being achieved. And it's being achieved and has been achieved on a number of projects through some step changes to what we would call more conventional approaches. So just to list some of those off, I suppose, we're looking at getting better measurement of and discrimination of waste versus ore in the mine. And there's a number of companies that are looking at that, turning that into a pre-concentration. In other words, don't waste time, energy, and effectively resources processing something that doesn't give value and doesn't produce what you need to produce. So being more selective about what we process. There are efficient comminution technologies coming on the market that can reduce the energy by half. And in theory, energy should be able to be reduced by about 80% from a rock breakage perspective. We've been looking at projects, and about 5 years ago now, we actually put in the first coarse particle flotation project in a hard rock application at Cadia. And that allows grind size to be coarsened and reduce power and water by about 30%. And when you coarsen your grind size, recovering the same amount of metal values from it, you actually produce a tailings that can free drain. The tailings becomes more stable. The footprint reduces by probably 20 or 30% again. You can use that sand actually for constructing your tailings dam wall. And now, in fact, your economics around recovering water from the finer fraction completely changes because you're able to reduce the amount that needs sort of energy and cost-intensive dewatering by about half. We're seeing a lot of renewables go into existing and greenfields projects. Some mines are even looking at things like pumped hydro. And others are looking at segregating their grinding circuits from their beneficiation circuit so that they can take advantage of, let's say, cheap renewable supply that's available, say, for solar during the day only. There's increasing focus on greenhouse gas assessments. And one of the interesting aspects there is we've often used steel media to grind rocks. For projects that are, we're seeing some projects just shifting to a naturally greening grid power supply. Others are looking at green supplies on site. But other projects were actually able to reduce the embodied greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the amount of media consumption by choosing different circuit designs. And then finally, we're commissioning a project at the moment with dry stack tailings over in Mexico. So the dry arid environments have always been looking at reducing water consumption, but we're seeing some of those changes flow through projects in other regions as well, where there's particularly, to reduce the cost of water and overall get a better outcome for the environment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. Some amazing step changes happening in the footprint area. It's really quite exciting. And Matt mentioned a few things he spoke about technology, and let's move on to that and the role technology plays in environmental sustainability. And as you all know, we've seen in recent years a convergence between technology and its role in solving and measuring environmental outcomes. Faye, if I could start with you, how have you observed this trend?
Well, you know, you see it in so many different ways. I mean, it's so lovely to hear the detailed, granular examples that Matt and Sarah were sharing, because, you know, we've been working on some work, everything from modeling, having new ways of using data that we've had for years to absolutely remodel the ore body to do exactly some of the things that Matt is talking about in terms of actually limiting the waste that gets mined. You know, sort of just don't extract it if all you're going to do is try and put it back on a tailings pile. At the same time, it's so at every single step of the value chain, you're seeing technology be used to not only be more targeted, but create better precision and actually be more predictable. Because the more predictability you can actually build into all aspects of the value chain, the more actual energy use you can take out. And that predictability also allows you to actually manage not, you know, everything from safety, sustainability, and everything else. So if you take a step back and you go, well, you know, I think somebody's mentioned in the chat box, you know, some of these concepts, they're not brand new, but it's actually been scaling them that's always has been quite of a challenge. You know, the actual convergence of IT and OT are really helpful in this space. It's something that we see more and more of, actually starting to combine data from lots of, not just different parts of the value chain, but different aspects of the data, whether it be the workforce data, the actual supplier input data, as well as the operational data. Typically, it's been really hard to actually get that integrated and to actually present it in such a way back to the operators so they can actually make meaningful decisions from it. So whether it's about driving more predictability through everything from autonomous haulage and drilling systems, right the way through to actually how you actually plan and schedule your rail or your port operations, etc. We're seeing technology being applied across the board. I think the difference being, I think what we've still got to do is, as I've mentioned, get to this point where we're actually looking at it as one uniform system and not all of the subsystems, because, you know, the thing that gets in our way just about every single time when we talk about really driving the power of the new technologies, whether it be cloud-based technologies or whether it be artificial intelligence and the rest, of which every single one of these examples is being applied in the industry, what we see is that it's still really difficult to integrate data across boundaries. And it's usually that's where the biggest problems still occur, is at the interfaces between different sections, whether it be different mines or whether it be different parts of the value chain. So tech is a big part of this. And, you know, I'm a big believer, if you have the data and you can give it to the people who know how to interpret it in a way that they can use it, then magic happens and we actually start to solve those problems, because our industry is full of problem solvers. They love to do that kind of stuff. So show them what they need to work on and they'll work on it.
Great, thanks, Faye. Sarah, following on from Faye's answer, how have you observed the trend at Harmony?
Yeah, I think, and this has probably been touched on a few times already, like, I think we're sort of at a bit of a changing of the guard. You know, we've been in a place where we've often been sort of reactive in how we adopt technologies to lend themselves to environmental outcomes. You know, the technology might be put in place for one purpose, and then it's almost an afterthought as to what it might be able to offer up in terms of environmental upside and reporting improvements and things like that. I mean, you know, certainly the ore and the waste example is fairly classic for us. Definitely been making great improvements over the years in things like our waste dump construction mapping. So there's nothing new or novel about that, but certainly the level of information that we're now reporting at an individual truck movement level, and understanding the material properties that are on that truck and exactly where it's being moved to on a waste rock dump, and and what that means for our dump management practices and potential sort of environmental repercussions. Like certainly there's a lot happening in that space. I think what's been really fascinating as we've started to embark more on our detailed closure planning is, I guess, you know, there's some really exciting opportunities in that space for novel technologies and embedding them at the outset of the kind of the next phase of the life cycle of a mine. And, you know, this kind of comes back to, I guess, it's a transition as well when you move out of an operations phase where you have got an abundance of resources and technology and support in place to maybe kind of have these wins and these gains. At mine closure, you know, 5, 10, 20 years down the track, you're likely looking at a situation where you're trying to, you know, whittle down the amount of people on site. You want to do things as remotely as possible. So what are the technology opportunities that present themselves in that space? And I know, you know, particularly for us, we've started to think around, we're going to have pit lakes that present themselves at mine closure, and the accessibility to those pits will be very challenging, you know, when we're no longer up there maintaining access to those. You know, what are the drone capabilities to be able to profile the chemistry through that water column, and for us to then be able to communicate that information to the regulators to demonstrate we're meeting compliance criteria. You know, what are other opportunities, for example, in the rehabilitation space for some of those really extreme high walls, for example? You know, how can you tackle revegetation for some of those landforms? So I think the mine closure space is really one where we're starting to kind of had to get our thinking caps on, get some really unique and novel, or, you know, at least adapt and change some of the technologies that we've had in play for the operational phase. And how can that serve our purpose, you know, as we move into different phases of the mine life cycle. And I think the other thing, and certainly Faye touched on it already as well, is just in terms of, you know, what the data, like how can we make that really work for ourselves? Like, what are the opportunities with some of these fantastic data platforms and software solutions now to really support, you know, mining company goals to be transparent in our reporting and disclosure of data, of our performance. And, you know, certainly we're always pursuing chances and opportunities for things like, can we have a module, for example, that might be a live share with our regulators so that they can see in real time, space and time, you know, how is our tailings dam performing? What are the geotechnical and geochemical characteristics of that? So I think that there's a lot that's happening in that space as well. And that's certainly from, you know, a disclosure and reporting point of view is very exciting.
Thanks, Sarah. Matt, earlier you touched on comminution and minerals processing. That's traditionally been an area overlooked for technical innovation. I'm just wondering what advancements you have seen in that area and whether you could expand on your earlier points.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. It's an interesting question, and I often hear statements sort of along the lines of the mining industry is slow to adapt and it's risk averse and it doesn't actually innovate much and all these sorts of things. And I suppose over the last few years in particular, I've been thinking a lot about the context into which decisions are made and are they in fact good or bad, and what are the reasons for, in an effort to understand how to better change them and sort of improve the trajectory of the industry, if you like, sort of being very much at the coalface of that. So, I mean, I suppose if you put yourself in the shoes of a project developer, you know, initially and historically, it's very much a technical, economic-based decision on how you're going to do a project, how you're going to develop it, and it needs to consider a whole range of ore body and project factors, the risks, the timelines are incredibly long, sort of 5 to 10 years. There's permitting, there's all sorts of interfacing with various parties. And these projects are inherently at a scale, meaning the capital requirements are very large, and changing approach or tack is difficult. And when you map that against the ore bodies that we've produced or sort of extracted, they have historically been relatively high grade compared to what we have today, and that immediately leads you to a path of maximising extraction. The interesting and sort of exciting part about the industry at the moment is actually with the decreasing head grades and with the increasing drivers around environmental and social contexts, we're more able to look at new approaches. In fact, many projects have to look at new approaches because they don't make economic sense. And actually, when you recast these projects in that different light and you look at the new technologies that are available to help process them, you can actually come up with these solutions that I mentioned earlier that improve, it's the win-win-win situation, the economic, the environmental, and the social outcomes all at the same time. And it sounds strange to say that when the head grades are lower, but basically the reason for that is the economic assessments push you to extract similar amounts, maybe sacrificing a small amount of recovery for much lower effort. And actually, when you think about what we're doing to recover metals, we're grinding fine, we're putting lots of effort in, we're spending a lot to recover the last few percent. Actually, some of these technologies allow us to very carefully dial back the effort in a step jump without actually losing the extraction that we're getting. And actually, we're seeing some very new sort of cutting edge approaches that are saying, well, we're not actually going to crush and mill and grind this ore to float it at all. We're going to look at new leaching approaches that operate in different regimes. And some of those are already being developed in South America at the moment by various companies. So there really is that lens of lower grade can actually help drive sustainability. And the context, I think, is the real takeaway message I'm trying to leave you with here, is that it's all around context for innovation. And currently, I think the context is right.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for that. We've been hearing, obviously, about technology increasingly being used for environmental benefits. Peter, obviously that opens up a lot of opportunities for the MET sector. What are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, Marianne, I guess Sarah gave us a great sort of expose just a few minutes ago into the range of initiatives and efforts that are being made at Harmony across the range of sites and the range of environments they're working in, and the range of challenges that they've got to face to provide that transparency to be confident in their governance and custodianship of the sort of places they're working in. All the way through to rehabilitation and walking away in a few years' time, hopefully. But these aren't now sort of spot fires that need to be sort of managed and we'll forget about it for a while. They've become business as usual, day-to-day requirements that need to be built into the sort of operating environment where miners work. And from a point of view of a METS company, that provides a lot of opportunities, because the collection, the accuracy, the management and the sharing and the reporting and the interpretation of the data and the processes and the workflows and the various stakeholders involved has really opened up a whole range of different opportunities. And most of those can benefit greatly from the application of technology to provide efficient, robust, sustainable tools and systems to work within for companies, the same as they would for accounting or geological modelling or HR or anything else. So that's sort of where it's heading. There's a lot of opportunities. Maptech recently invested in K2Fly here in Perth, which is a company that focuses specifically on providing those solutions as sustainable software products that can operate, across a range of different areas, from tailings dam management to land access and resource governance and reporting, and providing that layer of transparency across the stakeholder sort of environment, but also making it a reasonably efficient and reasonably easy solution to build into a business on a day-to-day long term. So I think we're going to see plenty more opportunities in that space. I think it's, you know, it's not a trend that's going to stop or reverse. It's become normal. I think the front cover of the latest Time magazine has an article about you know, the mining industry's response to climate change and being green. You know, this is now a mainstream issue that everyone's aware of, and we need to do it. It's not an option. So it's again going to present a whole new range of application areas for METS companies to deliver solutions into.
Great, thanks, Peter. We've been talking about technology so far playing a critical role in driving sustainability, but also, and Faye, you touched upon this, it's essential that we attract and retain current and future talent to create a real step change in environmental practices. How can mining and METS organisations get the right people in a very difficult environment and such a competitive skills landscape? Faye, if I could go to you.
Yeah, thanks. You know, the more and more I think about this, it's actually all about two major things. One is organizations now are, well, people want to work for organizations that are called purpose-led organizations, ones that are very clear in stating, you know, why that, not just vision like we used to do in the old days, you know, fancy words and put them on walls everywhere, but actual purpose. And that goes to really having a higher purpose, being clear about what that is. What are you giving back is often the real aspect of this. You know, what is your attitude as an organization to components of sustainability, social consciousness, and, you know, general corporate citizenship. And what we find is more and more the younger generation, and I have two late stage teenagers, so I feel this quite a lot even in my home, is that, you know, they have absolutely no tolerance for organizations that aren't prepared to go the extra mile and do what's right for the planet. Now, I'm sure there's some exceptions out there, but en masse, the generations that are coming through into university ages today or are at universities today are looking to join an organization that actually is clear on its status and its intentions relative to sustainability in particular. And that means that all organizations, if they wish to attract them, firstly need to be really clear about what they stand for in this space, and not to play lip service to it, because what we find is that these same people will join on the promise of that purpose, but they'll leave just as quickly if they don't believe that it's actually happening for real. So they have much lower tolerance for we'll get there in N years' time. They want to see it in action. And I loved a bit of what Matt was saying around some of the work that they're doing, because, you know, sometimes we have to be, and mining, you know, is known for its big stage gate approval processes and bureaucracy out the wazoo. And you know, that's not how the world works anymore. Iterative and agile is the way that everybody works. People don't know the answer in all cases. They want to be able to experiment small and build it out from there, and be far more creative and far more involved. They don't want to be told that's not your problem, that's somebody else's. You just sit at your desk and do your thing, right? So it doesn't really matter, you know, what skills you're looking for. It could be any of the skill sets where you're trying to attract the brightest and the most capable people out there. They are choosing on very different factors today than just on salary and the job title, right? In fact, those, you know, those things, believe it or not, I mean, you'll all have had your demands on salaries because there's a war for talent out there, but they're actually, believe it or not, secondary to purpose. And but that purpose needs to be translated into behaviors, mindsets, and an ethos inside the organization. These folks are digital natives. What does that mean? That it's like, imagine they were born with a device in their hands. You know, they actually have been using devices Always. They expect things to be digital. They expect to know what's going on. They expect to be to the information age where they can just plug in and find out that information. A bit like Sarah was saying, you know, real-time access to data, which is coming right off the operations. So we need to coolify mining, right? Mining has to be cool, and it's not. It's not the kind of place that most people, most folks, unless they have family and friends that have worked in mining, or they just happen to come from the communities where they know, you know, they know it really well, is not necessarily going to attract. It's, you know, go to a startup if you want the cool stuff. Don't go to a big mining company. Well, how do you have that startup type of mentality, the thing that will attract these bright, because we need the brightest, and we need people to continue to go down the engineering pathways that will lead to the reimagining and the rethinking of these processes, just like Matt was talking about. So I'm really excited about the potential, because I think they're the ones who are going to do what we call reverse mentoring. They're going to come in and they're going to shift middle management and even upper layers of management by challenging them. And the organizations that will win are the ones who actually encourage that, who actually want these generations who think differently to the boomers and all of the rest of us to actually shift forward in a fundamentally new way.
Great, thanks, Faye. Yeah, coolifying the mining industry sounds exactly what we need to do. We've probably only got time for one or two more questions. In addition to coolifying mining, I think to make step changes, we also need to do it in a reasonable time frame. We need collaboration. I just was wondering, Sarah, if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, I do actually. So I think, you know, one of the more, I guess, exciting pathways that we have been able to embark upon, and this is, you know, in the PNG context again, is, you know, involving third parties in what we do. So there's nothing new and novel in that. And, you know, Faye alluded to our love of taking an idea through iteration after iteration of studies and gating and so on and so forth. But it does lend itself to, you know, bringing in third parties, bringing in experts, bringing in academia to act as, you know, an independent peer review, or to act as a third party advocate sometimes. And, you know, certainly for us, that has presented some really exciting opportunities. So we often partner with the universities in PNG and use some of their senior professors in mining sort of departments, but then also through that we will then bring on board to some of these review processes, you know, current undergraduate or current postgrad candidates as well, and bring them in so that they've got an opportunity to sort of, you know, appreciate what they're learning in the classroom and how that applies to real life worked examples as well. So I certainly think that, you know, the project space is quite an exciting one where you can definitely kind of foster those collaborative opportunities with universities and lend that sort of upskilling and opportunity for learning as well. You know, I mentioned before that our Wafi Golpu project is a joint venture. So that's another fantastic way where you can, you know, share experiences. It comes with all sorts of challenges as well, but definitely that's a really great way for companies to kind of come together, check and challenge, I guess, business as usual approaches, and to, you know, have to work around different approaches to developments, and to, you know, I guess, think outside the box as well. I might just make a slightly unrelated comment, but to follow up on what Faye was saying before, on how the next generation, you know, really want to have a purpose front and center. We recently did a recruitment program for a graduate environment officer, and it was fascinating and really encouraging to see how many of our candidates had spent the time to navigate the company website, to understand what our operating philosophy was, to interrogate our responsible stewardship pillar. And so many of them came to the interview actually putting a whole bunch of questions back to us that they had gone away and read. And so I totally concur with what Faye is saying. Like, it, you know, there's that push is definitely going to come from flipping things on its head, I think, in the years to come.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to have to leave it there. I know we've got a lot more to talk about, but just so that we have time for the audience Q&A, that was a fantastic discussion. It's generated quite a lot of interest in the questions. So I'll do the questions in the order of the voting, and if we don't get time to get to all the questions, we'll get back to you after the webinar. So the first question is from Bruce Atkinson. Regarding slowness to innovate and adopt new technology, a significant driver of that may be the very short timeframes that mining companies use for payback evaluations. Anyone like to take that question or make that comment?
I could
go ahead, Pete.
Sorry, Faye. Yeah, I could speak to that if you like. Hi, Bruce. Yeah, look, the timeframes that success is judged over sometimes seem misaligned with the objectives, and sometimes seem misaligned with the scope of what the solution or new technology is trying to do. But in time, the value of a good solution and the value inherent in solving some of these challenges and providing a sustainable outcome in the business, is really hard to argue with. So, the interface between sort of finding good solutions to business challenges and establishing processes and workflows and models that provide the outcomes for business and the let's say the purchasing or sort of buying sort of practices in companies, they often need a little bit of massaging and evolution to get right, but they get there in the end is my experience.
Thanks, Peter. Anyone else?
Chip in a little bit there, Bruce.
Sorry, Matt.
The classic example is tailings dams, right? Where you've got run it for a certain number of years and you're discounted at a discount rate that's, let's say, 8% typically, which is a typical sort of investment return target. And then all of a sudden your future costs disappear into nothing. I suppose the issue with the assessments when they're typically done and those assessments drive the decision making is historically there probably hasn't been good realization of the downside. So it's not just cost upside by reducing costs, but if you don't adequately take into account the sum of the risks times the consequences, which is more art than science probably, then you end up with very different answers. The irony is that, and I did this exercise and presented at a tailings conference, if you do actually look at the cost of something going wrong, and you could call it, let's say, a tailings dam failure, that cost per tonne will far exceed the incremental cost per tonne it would have cost you to do something correctly in the first place. So I think discount rate or cash cost is part of the problem, but the other problem is just the framework under which a lot of those social and economic assessments are actually done.
Okay, great, thank you. I might move on to the next one. I think, Faye, you might be able to start on this one. So this is from Jolene James, a very popular question. How feasible are circular economy approaches with current technology, such as metals recycling? And is this the next big disruptor for mining?
I've been part of a number of conversations around circular economy and its role. I think, I think mining is at a stage where the energy or the oil and gas industry was pre their involvement in renewables. Everybody saw it as a threat until it actually became part of the total life cycle of the product. And I do think it's feasible. I think we will need mechanisms to deal with scope 3. We will also need mechanisms as an industry to actually cope with the growth in demand and becoming tougher and tougher to mine in a number of places. So I actually think that it's one of those scenarios where if the mining industry gets behind it in a constructive way, it'll never take over the entire industry, but it will actually play an important role in the future, but it requires the right kind of backing. And so I recognize, and I saw some of the answers already, it is tricky to make economic right now. But we've got to ask ourselves the question, isn't that part of the solution, is to figure out that way? And with the weight of the mining industry behind that, wouldn't it actually become more successful? So that's my challenge back.
Great, thanks, Faith. Anyone else got anything to add to that question on circular economy?
Just a brief comment. Lead from lead acid batteries out of cars, for example, is already recycled at about 98 or 99%. It's really high. But I think the interesting one to watch is going to be the recycling of the lithium-ion batteries, the nickel, manganese, cobalt, cathodes, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of players, car manufacturers, etc., already moving in that space to collect black mass and processes that are being developed to treat it. So it's definitely happening. It's on its way if it's not here already.
Great, thanks, Matt. Our next most popular question, is it possible to build and operate a mine without diesel? Can organisations actually do this only using renewable energy sources? Anyone like to tackle that one? Thanks, Matt.
Happy to chip in, but yeah, absolutely. There's a small junior miner, so it's not just always the big end of town, I suppose, is the point here. Small junior miner in New South Wales has retrofitted front end loader as fully electric. Diesel trucks have actually been diesel over electric for a long time. The issue is the power plant, obviously. And a lot of people are looking at this, that the first instances are likely to be underground. So in underground, you have huge costs for ventilation. You actually save all those costs, and it's ventilation, I should say, to remove the diesel particulates out of the underground mine. There's huge opportunities when you couple autonomous vehicles with electric. So yeah, certainly there's Anglo American, others are all looking at this, and it will certainly happen.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just going to add there, from our experiences in PNG, we're certainly blessed up there that the hydropower affords, really major upside to our direct emissions tied up with, the major power consumption side of things. It comes back to the reliability of supply, in our instance. And certainly I think that's where we're struggling to navigate towards 100% renewables. There's opportunities, of course, with the battery, but kind of making sure that certainty of supply is guaranteed is the challenge for us at the moment in kind of taking the next step towards being totally renewable from our kind of major energy supply perspective as well. I know from the Wafi-Golpu project, when we recycle the feasibility before that progresses into the construction phase, reevaluating the whole sort of energy profile of that is one of the major undertakings. We did the last feasibility study less than 4 years ago now. And even just in that time frame, there has been so much change, so many more opportunities that you could dial into the picture. And I think that comes back to what Faye mentioned, at the start, is that wherever we can, we need to embed these opportunities from the outset, and Greenfields projects present a really exciting chance to be able to do that. So certainly, in dialing up that Wafi-Golpu project, recircling back on our power supply, all of the opportunities for underground electrification, reducing wherever we can the ventilation requirements to improve that energy profile and the energy mix is certainly a big part of what will be occurring prior to that project moving into the construction phase.
Thanks, Sarah. And actually the next most popular question is directed to you. You've pretty well answered it in what you just said, but we've probably got a few seconds for if you've got anything to add. The question is from Rohit. In regard to your organisation's net zero commitment, what are the initiatives and approaches your organisation are putting forward? So I know you've mentioned a lot. Are there any others to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think, I mentioned before that most of my involvement's on the Southeast Asian side of things. So we do have opportunities a little easier going this side of the world than our South African counterparts. I think it's 86% of our emissions are tied up with that direct energy consumption in South Africa because of contractual arrangements. That's all, to do with the farming in of the power supply there. So one of the major wins that we can have in the short term is really just changing out that energy mix and transitioning ourselves to in the South African space as well, some more having a greater proportion of renewables in the mix as well. I know that lots of the mining companies have recently been involved in an initiative run by Osmine, which is looking, it's called the Charge On Challenge. So again, that's looking at what opportunities there are to electrify the mining fleet. So there's some really exciting kind of collaborative programs that are in play as well. So certainly, kind of participating in new and emerging technologies and working with our peers to understand what else we can adopt. But yeah, the energy mix, I think, in terms of, achieving our first 5-year science-based target is probably where the gains can be made.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. I'm sorry, that's all we have time for today in the questions. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Faye, Peter, Sarah and Matt for their time and their valuable insights today. Before we go, if I just draw your attention to the next webinar in our series, there'll be a tech talk focusing on leading technologies to provide energy for the future mine. You can see the details there, and we'll be in touch with further details shortly. Thank you to everyone who's attended, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next Osmine webinar. Stay safe. Thank you.